Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Asia Society Korea webinar. My name is Mason Richey from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies and the Asia Society Korea Center here in Seoul, where I am a senior contributor. We are happy to have you here today to join us for this webinar, which is going to be focusing on Korea's relations with Israel, notably in light of what has happened in Israel and Palestine since October 7. We are 1 month out from Hamas's massacre and raid into Israel, which has precipitated a significant war in Israel itself, with possible implications for the region and globally. That's obviously part of where Korea comes into the story. So in that context, we're going to be talking about what is going on in Israel right now, what is happening in the broader Middle East right now, as well as Korea's relations with Israel, and not only South Korea, we note also North Korea and its relations with Hamas and other actors in the Middle East. So without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce our three guests today. In the first place, we have Ambassador Akiva Tor, who is currently the Israeli ambassador to the Republic of Korea. He is an extremely experienced diplomatic hand, and I will also note, in addition to being a very astute observer of both Korean and US and obviously Israeli and Middle East politics, also a real mensch, and we're obviously happy to have him here today. Secondly, we have joining us Lieutenant General In-Bum Chun, who is a frequent contributor to these Asia Society Korea webinars. He is a retired Republic of Korea Army general who has an extremely storied and decorated career that has earned him accolades and awards for bravery. And he also happens to be an extremely nice guy. We're happy to have him here. If you want to know more about his biography, please take a look at the Asia Society Korea website. And finally, we were joined by Sang Won Yoon, who is a journalist and a writer who focuses on Middle East politics. She has a history of her career that involves reporting on political risk for Bloomberg News, where she covered the Syrian civil war, North Korea's second succession, the United Nations. She has also reported on the Arab Spring in 2011. And I'll happily note that she's clearly one of the best placed people to be able to talk about the events today, insofar as in her long experience, she has become fluent not only in Korean, obviously, but also in French and Hebrew, and is even learning apparently some Arabic. So she's obviously someone with the linguistic skills to be able to tell us some of what's going on in Israel and on the ground in the Middle East. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get right into our questions right away. We're going to be relatively faster than we are today, simply because we have some time limitations on our guests. But with that being said, please, as I remind the guests, don't mind talking to each other, not just responding to my questions. I'll, of course, be happy for you guys to take over the chatter. I'm going to start with Ambassador Tor. Ambassador Tor, Israel has been and is still obviously going through an extremely difficult period. I want to begin by giving you the floor. You have carte blanche, and so I'd like to give you a few moments for you to say anything that you would like to tell Korea and Koreans regarding what has happened on October 7 and in the month since the massacre by Hamas.
Thank you very much, Mason. Thanks for doing this event, and thank you, Sang Won and In-Bum. Happy to spend this time with you. Look, indeed, we're in a difficult period, but Israel went through a period of a lot of political instability before this conflict with Hamas in Gaza. Now we're actually quite united. All of the people who were in the pro-democracy marches are basically mobilized out of desire, and we should stop quibbling about politics because we have a much bigger challenge right now. I think look, Israel has gone through a very serious trauma with the killing of so many, also soldiers. A lot of soldiers were killed, but primarily the killing of civilians, children, babies. It's something that hadn't ever happened actually since 1948, since the War of Independence. We haven't had, atrocity type casualties like this. And that's caused Israel to become very united, and we have a war cabinet which includes also the opposition, and we have clear goals, and that is to end Hamas rule in Gaza and to end Hamas primarily as an operative political or military principle in Gaza. And we can't wipe out the idea of Hamas because it's prevalent, and there's also Iran, it's not so different from it. But what we understood is that we can't deal with Hamas the way we did in the past, which was since 2007 when Hamas took over Gaza, throwing out the Palestinian Authority from there. We basically had, we had a mini war every 2 to 3 years, and then there would be Egyptian mediation. We'd go back to normal. Now we're facing an organization which is more like ISIS, and we understand that if we don't deal them a decisive blow, will harm our deterrence in the region. In other words, not to carry out what we need to carry out will be dangerous. It will invite Hamas to attack us, and it's this is the neighborhood where it's like that. If Hamas can do what it did and then still wake up and wave a flag that it's still shooting rockets at Israel, things won't be safe for us. Therefore, even though I think we're taking very hard hits to our image and we're being tarnished, nevertheless, first role of government is the safety of the people. That comes before defensive image. And therefore, I think that we will carry through, even if it'll be very difficult for us. That's how I'd start.
If I can hit you with two brief follow-ups that are sort of connected to image, if you will. The first is what how would you estimate the response from the South Korean government in terms of the support for Israel? Do you estimate it to have been adequate, let's say? And secondly, I think Israel has struggled a little bit, especially over the last few weeks, in the narrative space. At least I think in the U.S. in some places, particularly on the political left, but also some places on the political right, and also perhaps on the street in Europe, there seems to be an increasing focus on Israel's actions in Gaza, its adherence to international humanitarian law, as it's carrying out the actions that you, I think, legitimately and persuasively argue are necessary. What are the challenges that Israel is facing in this narrative space in order to refocus, on the necessity of Israel's self-defense? I happen to think, much the same way that you do. I, of course, think that international humanitarian law has to be followed, and that includes Israel. It also, of course, includes Hamas, which, very brazenly doesn't follow that. In fact, that's the whole part of their strategy, whether that be the actual incursion on October 7th and the massacring of civilians, or the way that they strategically place their forces, in Israel in places that, for instance, are hospitals or schools or otherwise, have civilians as human shields. How do you think Israel, or in what way can Israel go about trying to reclaim some of that narrative space that I think Hamas has somehow managed to capture?
Okay, well, I'll start with the first one. Look, I think Republic of Korea, formal reaction of government has been quite good. The political parties, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, President Yoon himself, have condemned Hamas, and the support, by the way, we also received both from the PPP and also from DP in their formal statements. So I think that Korea is, being quite supportive of Israel. There have been 2 conversations between Foreign Minister Park Jin and the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen. So I think that we're in a pretty good place. I would like, this is a later question, but I want to get it in. I would like Republic of Korea government to sanction Hamas using its, the legal architecture, which enabled sanctions on Iran and Russia. I think that should be applied to Hamas as well. And that's something which I hope would happen. Going to this issue about the narrative, look, the fact of the matter is we might not accept the figures being put out by the Hamas Ministry of okay, you're there, Mason.
Yeah, sorry,
I
I have a
think
little
it's
problem with my camera.
okay. Look, we don't have to accept the numbers of the Gaza Health Ministry, which is basically a Hamas propaganda arm. But nevertheless, it's clear that there is very significant collateral damage and harm to civilians during this fighting. And our challenge is that what should we do? Targeted bombing, fighting in an urban area, even according to the laws of war, striking only legal targets, it still creates a large amount of civilian casualties. That is the reality. And everything's being filmed and everything's, it's not far away. It's not, B-52s bombing in Afghanistan. It's right next to the Israeli border. So the international press is filming everything. And it's also causing a severe reaction in the Arab street. All these things are a big challenge for Israel. And we have to try to control it as much as we can. I tried to do that the other day. We showed to the Korean press, we showed an IDF film of all of the atrocity footage that we're not willing to put on TV because of the privacy of the families and because up till now we just don't do that. But you see Palestinian children killed. It's very difficult to look at. Nevertheless, what should we do? We have to destroy this organization and we have to find a way to fight them, even if they're hiding behind civilians. It doesn't mean that we're going to shoot through civilians, but it means that despite our very best efforts, there's going to be difficult scenes and significant casualties. You mentioned regarding the left, the progressive left. I think that there's a very serious problem in the discourse in the left on also American college campuses. I think it's actually shocking, and we're seeing a break between the Israeli left and global left, also between the American Jewish left and the global left. I think we've got a real problem. I think we have a real problem if the president of Harvard and the president of Stanford cannot stand up to student bodies who are condoning atrocities. That's a problem for Western civilization. It's not only a problem for Israel.
Thank you.
Mason, may I ask
That's a very coherent answer.
follow-up?
Yeah, Sang Won, I was going to ask you to jump in here too.
Sure. Ambassador, I had a question about sort of the long-term goals of image, because you mentioned safety of your citizens, rockets are continuing to fly in. And so destructing Hamas is the short-term immediate goal. But in the longer term, let's say the Hamas is expelled. What does the long-term kind of off-ramp, the diplomatic off-ramp to stabilize the region, what would that look like? Because even if Hamas is expelled with a void in leadership representing Gazans, and if you have that kind of vacuum, that can cause longer term instability to have that right on the border with Israel, right? I'm just curious what the Israeli government, how the leadership is approaching the
We have
objectives.
a vision and we have an idea about what post-war Gaza should look like, but we don't have it's a problem to talk about it because it's an issue of active diplomacy by the American Secretary of State right now. And by the way, now might not be we support all of Secretary Blinken's efforts, but they might not bear fruit at a time when Arab public opinion or popular opinion is so violently anti-Israel. So but ultimately it's clear Israel does not want to reoccupy Gaza. We don't want to be the occupying power at all. We thought we had stopped being the occupying power in 2005, and then the UN told us that we are still the occupying power, even though we're not there. But we definitely do not want to run Gaza. We have to return to a model of Palestinian self-determination. The fact that this model has not worked out up till now doesn't mean that we don't have to try again. Maybe in an interim stage, there needs to be an Arab trusteeship If the Arab states won't be willing, then maybe there has to be some other kind of trusteeship. But I shouldn't talk about it so much because Israel is not leading the effort right now. We're still in the warfare stage. But if you're asking me how we're imagining it, that's the direction. Perhaps there'll be a return of the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority is quite weak right now and doesn't seem to be willing to do it. So I think this will be a challenge because the question will be: Israel will say to the Palestinian Society, "Okay, self-determine." But if they're not willing to self-determine, or if they're only willing to allow the most radical elements to rule, then what will happen? So I think it's an issue of concern. But if you're asking me about how we see it, we certainly don't see Israel running it, and this will be a project, not a
Great.
colonial project, a self-determination project.
Great. Thanks for the answer. In fact, Sang Won, I wanted to get you to jump in on the questions I just asked, and then I want to turn to General Chun and get his input on a few things. If I could ask this to you, first of all, Sang Won, if you wanted to jump in on that narrative space question, you're in New York right now, perhaps you might want to jump in and say something about what you think is happening in the US with respect to the perception of what's happening in Israel right now. And then secondly, also, as someone who, is obviously also an expert on Korean politics, if you wanted to jump in and perhaps say something about your estimation of the South Korean government response in terms of supporting Israel adequately or not, that would be fine. So yeah, if you could jump in on that real quick, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, New York, is home to the largest number of Jews outside of Israel. And so one would think that the level of support that Jews or Israelis in New York have would be high. And I think in some ways it has been, but in recent weeks, I think there's been definitely a rise in anti-Semitism. I think it's been widely reported. And I think it's well known that escalated levels of anti-Semitism signals much more instability and insecurity for all in society. I have friends. I'm a mother of 2 young boys. Many of my friends, Jewish and Israeli, they're expressing concern, about will we be able to take our children to the park? There are protests happening at the parks, college campuses. In New York, the campuses are very much ingrained with the city. And so with that, there's definitely fears rising. I think it's a very complex question in terms of freedom of speech on campus. I think, Mason, as a professor yourself, you can, speak to the fact that many of these students are young and they don't really understand just how complex this issue is and what it actually means when they are saying some of the things that they are. And so that's just personally what I think is troubling, and something that's going to be a much deeper, longer term effort that needs to happen on a multi-pronged societal, political, cultural level. Now, in terms of the South Korean government's response, as a South Korean national, I would say with the support of Israel, despite having been under such a horrific attack, having collaborated on the safe evacuation of Korean nationals from Israel, I think that was great to see personally as a Korean national. Now, President Yoon has recently been in the region, I think helping to the multilateral diplomatic efforts that are going on in the region, as well as securing many of the energy discussions, right? As South Korea is heavily reliant on energy and gas from the Middle East. So in that front, I think there are efforts being made. Now, personally, I think I'm curious how the government is taking what is happening in Israel and right now to think about what does this mean for South Korea. We do have North Korea right over the border. It's very similar. North Koreans were the first to dig, kilometers long border tunnels, beneath the DMZ, very similar to the spider web of tunnels that Hamas has built, under the security wall, right? And so with those kinds of parallels, as well as reports of Iranian support, various terrorist groups, extending their supports to evade sanctions, like what does that mean? And I'd be curious to see, as Ambassador has mentioned, whether South Korea will take an effort in sanctioning Hamas and deepening their efforts to kind of curb illegal funds and transfer of funds, as well as other resources for nefarious uses.
Great, tremendous answer. I'm just gonna go on the record, and I might get myself in some trouble here, but I appreciate the official, South Korean government response. I frankly have found it a little bit crass the way that the government at various points seems to have framed what's happened there as, an issue of what is this going to do to our economic cooperation with Saudi Arabia, or what is this going to do with, potential construction contracts, or with our ability to get, potential nuclear reactors, construction projects and that sort of thing. So I've been a little disappointed, I think, in that respect. I understand why they do that. I mean, that strategic imperative is there, and states perhaps feel, and leaders feel like they have to do that. I wish perhaps that they had backpedaled at least a little bit on that, or at least not pushed so hard on the accelerator. But that's just my take, of course. And I've probably gotten myself now in terrible trouble, and will get myself disinvited from all kinds of events. But that's my honest opinion. You brought up university campuses. I personally am a darn near absolutist on free speech. I don't remember who said it, but someone said something to the effect of, I will defend your right to say anything offensive to me until my dying breath, even though I completely hate it. On the other hand, I think largely universities should just get out of the business of taking political stands on this type of thing. It gets them in all sorts of trouble, as we've seen right now. So that's sort of my take on it. What's happening in the U.S. left, I think, is a question, and to some degree, of course, on the right, is a question that we unfortunately simply don't have time for today. And I think it's interesting, Ambassador Tor, and you also, Sang Won, have brought that up. Sang Won, you brought up parallels, and I was going to get to this anyway, but happily you've already done my work for me. Some of the parallels between what happened in Israel and the North Korea, South Korea situation. And now I want to bring in General Chun, who's been waiting patiently. Thank you so much for that. Indeed, speaking of parallels and learning from others, General Chun, I wanted to ask you, what you think South Korea should be thinking with respect to this incursion that Hamas managed to pull off. The South Korean Ministry of National Defense, has argued that North Korea could adopt similar types of tactics. Do you think that's right? Why or why not? And what, in some sense, should the South Korean military have learned from what Hamas managed to pull off on October 7th?
Yeah, it's only been a month, so lessons learned will have to continue coming in. But I would say that it's not that we Koreans are going to learn from Hamas, but what the Hamas has learned from North Korea. North Korea has a long history of provoking and conducting direct strikes against the South Korean government. The last time was in 2015. And I'm not talking about shooting off missiles. I'm talking about, direct action against the Republic of Korea, either to destabilize Korea, or to create dissent, or to, in their mind, somehow dislodge the US forces here in Korea. So anything can happen. Although North Korea has a history of killing civilians, like the bombing of our Korean Airlines aircraft, even the North Koreans would not come in and target civilian targets like Hamas did. So I think that much credit needs to be given to the North Koreans. But we South Koreans must realize that anything can happen, that we must be very vigilant. And I was impressed by the fact that the Israeli Defense Force was able to react so quickly with this situation. Approximately 30 penetrations along the barrier line. I'm not too sure that South Korea can do that. So I hope that from this terrible incident, that at least on the military side, the South Koreans will realize that we need to really increase our preparedness.
Well, speaking of preparedness, or perhaps putting it a little bit differently, one of the things I think stood out to a lot of people, we haven't talked about it quite so much in the last week or two, as the narrative has shifted a little bit, but the question of how Israeli intelligence seemingly missed this. maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there was no intelligence failure. Perhaps it was a political failure to act on intelligence. But one way or the other, either the intelligence wasn't there, or the politicians had it but didn't act on it appropriately. What should South Korea take away from that in terms of its military intelligence vis-a-vis North Korea?
Yeah, so you know as much as I do from public reporting and some experts analyzing what they see so far, but I'm not going to go that route. One thing is very clear. The Israelis have been concentrating on intelligence analysis, collection, and invested in a lot of intelligence collection and disseminating process, more so than any other country. If the Israelis are surprised like this, and how Hamas was able to do this is a wonder. But if the Israeli intelligence can be fooled, we Koreans must really think about our goal and saying that we're going to be able to know 100% what our enemy is going to do. I think this is a great lesson that no matter how you put in to knowing what your adversary is doing, it's not going to be perfect. And so what do you do? What should we be doing? So I think from this so-called intelligence failure, we would really appreciate to know what happened and exchange the experience that the Israelis had to learn from a very big sacrifice a month ago.
Great. If I can hit you with one last, military related question. Ambassador Tor, I think brought it up very briefly, and also you brought it up. The ground campaign that Israel, has embarked on, is an urban campaign. It involves, fighting in tunnels. What is the South Korean military going to be observing in that regard? What sorts of tactical and operational and strategic and technological lessons is the South Korean military going to be trying to glean from Israel's experience in this type of urban warfare?
Yeah, the golden rule in urban warfare is don't do it. Don't go in there. Right now, the Israeli forces face a difficult battle with hostages to rescue, and then the adversary willing to use women and children to use as human shields. So this is a very, very difficult situation for the soldiers who are trying to accomplish the mission of taking down the military capability of Hamas. I do not envy the ground commander over there. There's going to be a lot of sacrifices. If I were the Israelis, I would contain as much as I can, but with the goal of getting the hostages out first, and then deal with the Hamas leadership gradually in the traditional fashion that Israeli is famous for. But anyway, to the point of Sang Won, what you said, right now there's a lot of dust. This is war dust. It's unimaginable and it's savage. You should not. People like you, ordinary civilians, should not need to see it. And I'm very concerned that people will think that war is something that can be explained in human terms. So I hope for a quick resolution for this this situation that we see in the Middle East.
Thanks for that. Like I said, we've got to get one of our panelists out of here in precisely 4 minutes. So I want to hit Sang Won with 2 questions on a lightning round. So if you can just give me about a minute each on those, and then I want to give the floor back to Ambassador Tor for a final word. Sang Won, there was one of the connections between South Korea and the Middle East is frozen funds that were held in South Korea, and a series of negotiations took place to release those frozen funds to go to Iran. And of course, we know that Iran, backed this, Hamas-led raid and the larger, the larger conflict that Hamas has engaged in. To what extent did that money play a role in some way? Is one question. And then secondly, zooming out a little bit, and here I'm going to be crass myself, although I criticized the South Korean government for it earlier. What are South Korea's interests in the Middle East? What are its diplomatic and economic interests? And how seriously would South Korea be affected if this conflict were to widen and perhaps begin to involve, Iran or Syria or Lebanon or, God forbid, Saudi Arabia? So if you give me sort of 2 minutes on that, and then we're going to come back to Ambassador Tor for a final comment.
Sure thing. Regards to the frozen funds, I actually don't think those funds, there was enough time where that they ever were able to be leveraged by Hamas, vis-a-vis Iran. I think, the US government actually blocked usage of those $6 billion. And so I think what's more interesting to me is the timing in which this October 7th attack happened. Aside from the fact that it's the 30th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, it was on the eve of an Israel-Saudi Arabia agreement. And I think Iran, seeing the encroachment, the dangers to their security that they felt that alliance could potentially pose, I think that's what actually potentially might have triggered or actually helped this attack happen. Now, in terms of South Korean interests in the Middle East, I think to your point about how crass you have found the Korean reaction to some parts of what's going on there in Israel between Hamas right now, I actually think it's a sign of just how dire the South Korean economy is and just how desperate in a way the South Korean government is to keep the economy afloat and ensure that it stays that way. In terms of interests, my father, he opened Hyundai Corporation's offices for the Middle East in Tel Aviv in 1994, right after the signing of the Oslo Accords, when times were very different from now. And so that's where I got my Hebrew. And I should say specifically, it was in Ramat Gan. And so the reason, Korea in post-Korean War economy was just so desperate that they needed to rely on relations with oil-rich Arab countries, right? And that's why in the 70s and 80s, Korea's relationships with Israel has suffered. But with this Oslo Accord, that's what heralded an entryway of South Korea into pursuing more business interests with Israel, the way that my father had for his company. And so maybe I'm not directly answering your question, Mason, but I think it just signals just the economic state of things and where the priorities lie for South Korea.
Great, thank you very much. Ambassador Tor, we're going to give you the final word. Take as much time as you need. And if I was going to ask a question, although you do not have to respond to it, it would probably be something like this: How does Israel, or how do Israel and Korea come out of this current crisis stronger together? You don't have to answer that question, but that's the one I would ask you. But you can obviously.
Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I answer your question, Mason? You said I'm a mensch. First of all, a couple things. First of all, thank you, panelists, for very insightful comments. Look, I think that Israel has to possibly has to prosecute this war quicker than maybe is safe for our soldiers, because we have an international time clock and we're aware of the environment that we're working in. But at the end of the day, I think that Western Europe, the United States, like-minded Republic of Korea, Japan, they want Israel to win. I think they'll be very unhappy if Israel doesn't win. So we need to find a way to do it quickly and with reasonable collateral damage. Or we have to. I mean, we'll get past this. But at a more optimistic note, even though we're at a dark moment. Tomorrow, for example, I'm speaking at Jungong Daily Innovation Forum, and I was asked to speak for half an hour and not to speak about the war at all. So we will go back to levels of kind of cooperation that Israel and Korea need together. You know, I think that we were also not only was the Israel-Saudi track moving forward, I think the Israel-Korea track was moving forward as well. I think we were in the direction of a presidential visit the first time in 60 years, and I really hope that that will come back. To speak, though, at a lesson of how Israel and Korea should work closer together within this framework, I think something that I've spoken with General Chun about many times, I think that Israel and Korea have to get to a much deeper engagement between themselves on missile defense and the creation of new technologies, which can interdict artillery, short-range rockets, and also ICBMs. The current level of technology which exists in the world is not sufficient to defend either country against the threats we face, and we should work on it together. High-powered laser, all these things. We haven't done it so far at an adequate level of cooperation. I hope that we'll move forward on it.
Well, let's hope that that's the silver lining on the dark cloud. So I'm just going to go ahead and wrap us up there. And once again, thank Ambassador Tor for joining us today, and also General Chun In-Bum, and lastly, Yoon Sang Won. I think you all made an excellent set of points, and I am positive that our viewers are going to come out of this experience knowing more and having a better understanding of not only what's happening on the ground and in Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also in terms of the relations between Korea and Israel and Korea and the broader Middle East. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks to all of you who have sat through this 35 minutes roughly of discussion. Please join us again for future Asia Society Korea webinars. Thanks again. Bye-bye.